Good morning. I would love to dedicate this lecture about Dante to Anna Maria, Dante's lover from Torino. Ciao. So, Dante died in Ravenna in 1321, and 2021 is the anniversary of Dante. So a lot of celebrations about the Italian national poet. But who's Dante? Who was Dante Alighieri? This is the famous portrait, late 15th century, by Sandro Botticelli. So Botticelli portrayed Dante many years after Dante's death. And this image became a kind of icon of Dante's face. But did Dante really look like this one? This one, to me, looks like the famous Hollywood Sherlock Holmes, Basil Rathbone, and looks pretty funny. But how really was Dante Alighieri? We have some portraits of him. One of the most famous ones and the earliest ones is this one in the Bargello Palace in Florence, 1337, discovered in 1840. This guy, dressed in red, is supposed to be Dante Alighieri by his friend Giotto. We know that Dante met Giotto in Padua, 1305, when Giotto was working in the Scrovegni chapel, and Dante too was in Padua, according to the commentary on the Divine Comedy by Benvenuto da Imola, mid-14th century. And Giotto actually died in 1337, so we have to think that this is by follower of Giotto, student of Giotto. But it's considered a very accurate portrait of Dante Alighieri, even if we are not sure that this guy is Dante Alighieri. But we have another image of Dante. Around 20 years ago was discovered in a palace nearby the Bargello one, the palace of the Guild of Judge in Florence, this fragment of a fresco painting picturing Dante Alighieri. And for sure, we know that this guy is Dante Alighieri, portrayed more than 50 years after Dante's death. We can see, the traditional long nose, the jaw here, and eyes, even if it doesn't look like Botticelli's one. We have quite interesting record too about Dante's face. Is by Giovanni Boccaccio, who wrote Life of Dante, or Trattatello in laude di Dante. And Boccaccio describes Dante Alighieri. He says that his face was long, his nose aquiline, and his eyes rather big than small. His jaw were large, and his lower lip protruded. His complexion was dark, and be careful, his hair and beard thick, black and curly. So Dante Alighieri was bearded, according to Boccaccio. We know that Boccaccio never met Dante, but he modeled this portrait on Dante's nephew, who looked like Dante Alighieri. but here we can find some characteristics of Dante. You know, a long face, aquiline nose, and protruded lower lip. Actually, the Divine Comedy became soon very popular after Dante's death. We have a lot of manuscripts of the Divine Comedy, and the first places to copy Dante's poem were Bologna and Florence. Some of those manuscripts are decorated with miniatures picturing Dante Alighieri. One of the first ones is the Codex Palatino 313, attributed to Florentine miniaturist painter Pacino di Buonaguida, and we are around the 30s of 14th century. Dante Alighieri, here dressed by blue, is with his guide Virgil, the Roman poet, and actually looks like average Florentine 14th century guy. Well, not realistic portrait, just a stereotype of intellectual of those times. In another work attributed to Pacino da Buonaguida, we can see the same idea. Young man with, the old wise Virgil with a long beard, and Dante is dressed by bigio or blue, navy blue clothes. 1340s, another work. This is in Rome, the Manuscript Urbinus Latina 378, and also here we can see the capital with Dante Alighieri. This one looks pretty interesting because here Dante looks a little bit bearded, according to Boccaccio's description. Here, same codex. Here is Dante with Beatrice. So, the Divine Comedy became very, very popular, as I told you, and also we can see miniatures by other artists. This is the so-called Maestro delle Effigie Domenicane, is a manuscript in Germany, 1330s, and here we can see Dante Alighieri in his studio and Dante with, at the beginning of the Divine Comedy with, leopard. Also here, Dante is pictured dressed by blue as a young man, no particular characteristic, just a stereotype of young intellectual. Same master, a different manuscript. This is in Milan, 1337, Dante with Virgil. Here we can see Dante, Virgil, the leopard, and here we can see how Dante has red hairs, but no beard, not long nose, nothing about a realistic portrait. We can see bearded Dante Alighieri and dressed by red in this manuscript in London, Egerton 943. Here Dante is bearded, pretty long nose, and this work is around the same period, the first half of 14th century. Also in Budapest there is this manuscript, this wonderful manuscript with miniatures, and also here Dante is thinking, and it looks a little bit birded. Red hairs, red bird. Around the same period, but here Dante can't be identified, is by a famous painter from Pisa, Francesco Traini, mid-14th century. So I show those ones just to let you know how, there are many manuscripts picturing Dante Alighieri, but not as a specific figure, but just a stereotype of young poet, as this one from Paris, second half of 14th century, Dante and Beatrix, and here Dante and the leopard. Young intellectual. Here is birded in this one, 1378. So Dante, Virgil, lion. Or late 14th century, this one looks pretty funny with pretty long nose, but no aquiline. Just young man of 14th century can be identified because the hat and clothes. Also in painting, Dante Alighieri doesn't look like Botticelli's one. This is Andrea del Castagno, Dante Alighieri, mid-15th century, and also we can see that the nose doesn't look aquiline, middle-aged wise man, but it's not particularly characteristic as Dante Alighieri according to Botticelli's portrait. Or in the famous painting in Florence around the 60s of 15th century by Domenico di Michelino, Dante Alighieri and the Divine Comedy and Florence. Here we can see Brunelleschi's dome, for instance, but it's a little bit more characterized, but not like Botticelli's one. This one looks pretty interesting. Second half of 14th century. This is from a very important manuscript in the National Library in Florence, second half of 14th century, and here, finally, Dante looks pretty close to Botticelli's one, and this one can be considered a model for Botticelli's work. Very aquiline nose, jaw, and eyes, pretty close. This book looks very interesting. This is a Divine Comedy, beautiful decorations, and inside more miniatures about the Dante Alighieri, but they don't look like the first page, the drawing we saw, just stereotypized work. But this book was a property of a very important guy. Here on the first page we can see his name, Francesco Sassetti, son of Tommaso, Florentine citizen. And here on the first page we can still see a little bit faded the Sassetti family crest. That's pretty important because Francesco Sassetti, here portrayed by Ghirlandaio, was a very important figure in Renaissance Florence. He was a banker. He was we can say, the general manager of the famous Medici Bank, close friend and collaborator of Lorenzo de' Medici the Magnificent, and friend of some relevant the figures of art world in Florence. He was friend of Agnolo Poliziano, the poet, the philosopher, Neoplatonist philosopher Marsilio Ficino, the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio, and, be careful, Botticelli. So, it's interesting that this manuscript with this figure of Dante Alighieri was property of friend of Botticelli. And we can compare the drawing 14th century of Dante Alighieri with Botticelli's portrait. We can say that finally the drawing and Botticelli created the iconography of Dante Alighieri, as we can see today everywhere. We can see a similar one by Luca Signorelli in Orvieto, a little bit more characterized here, or finally in Raffaello in the Vatican rooms in the Parnassus, 1509, Raffaello portrayed Dante Alighieri, modeling his portrait on Botticelli's one. So my idea is that the drawing of the Divine Comedy purchased by Sassetti became model for Botticelli, and Botticelli became model for the traditional iconography of Dante Alighieri as we know still today. But anyway, how really was Dante? The Department of Paleoanthropology, Biology in Bologna and Frankfurt got in Ravenna the skull of Dante Alighieri. They recreated the jaw of Dante Alighieri, and by studying it, they modeled the Dante Alighieri portrait. So instead of Botticelli imagery, Botticelli portrait, we can see the original, the true Dante Alighieri, pretty close anyway to Botticelli's one. Thank you.